Right now I'm outside Harry Tuff's Public House, one of many pubs in the area that offers a rich atmosphere and great service. Let's take a look inside. Pubs like these are hot places for gatherings of all kinds and are an important aspect of cultures of many societies, like those in the United Kingdom, United States, and Ireland.
But what if a pub like this became the target for political violence?
Today, on The People's History, we'll be analyzing the Birmingham pub bombings and their effect on British society. How close did the United Kingdom come to democratically backsliding? Let's take a look. The Birmingham bombings took place on November 21st, 1974. Thought to be committed by the IRA. This event would leave scars on British society, even to this day. But before we get too far into that event, there are some things you need to know for this analysis to make sense. Unless you're from the British Isles, the geography can be a little confusing.
These are the British Isles. There's no single sovereign political body ruling over everything here. This is the United Kingdom, which is composed of England, Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland. Over here we have the Republic of Ireland, which isn't governed by the United Kingdom. This is Great Britain, which will be important for later. Notice how it doesn't include Northern Ireland? It's probably best that you take caution when discussing any of these entities, because the wrong name here can have significant political implications.
For hundreds of years, there has been a great deal of tension between Ireland and Great Britain, dating all the way back to the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169, marking the beginning of British meddling in Irish affairs. The British are known for their expansive history of colonization. The British are known for their expansive history of colonization. The British are known for their expansive history of The British are known for their expansive history of civilizing indigenous peoples across the globe. Ireland was historically very distinct from England, culturally and religiously. The entirety of the British Isles was Catholic as a result of the Roman and Norman invasions, up until 1534 when King Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church and founded the Church of England. Although the British Isles accepted this religious transition over time, Ireland heavily resisted a forced conversion and remained largely Catholic. In addition to the religious differences between the two, Ireland didn't always accept English as a language.
The Celtic language of Gaelic isn't mutually intelligible with English and remained a part of the identity of the Irish people. In addition to the language, the Gaelic culture is also distinct from English culture, with distinct Gaelic sports and holidays.
All things considered, it's easy to see how British attempts at assimilating the Irish were met with heavy resistance. But if the Irish were so determined about retaining their culture, even under a political union, how did this happen?
All you need to know about the split is that this guy, James I, heavily developed the area into an English plantation in the early 17th century. He did this by stealing the land from Gaelic lords and giving it to English colonists. Bada bing bada boom, you have a British Northern Ireland. Over the coming centuries, of course.
Irish political submission to Great Britain was complete by 1801 with the formation of the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Even so, the fight for sovereignty was only beginning. Throughout the next century, there were numerous attempts at Home Rule bills that would give Ireland a significant degree of sovereignty.
The bill finally passed in 1914, displeasing the Unionists in Northern Ireland, who were very loyal to the British. The success of the Home Rule bill led to Sinn Féin, an Irish National Party, taking power and declaring a war of independence against the British. This really amounted to what we would consider a series of terrorist attacks, mostly in North Ireland. The group that carried out these attacks was the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army.
The IRA's campaign started to falter in 1921, with the British gaining more control. The British response, however, was quite cruel. The tactics used by the British were internationally condemned to a degree for their anti-liberal qualities, which will be important to remember later.
Although the IRA was defeated, the conflict resulted in the formation of the Irish Free State, which had even more independence than Ireland previously had.
The technical defeat of the IRA didn't stop their operations, as they continued to carry out attacks throughout the 20th century. They sought to liberate the whole of Ireland, including North Ireland. Skipping ahead around half a century, the Troubles was a time of severe conflict, led by the PIRA.
The PIRA, or the Provisional IRA, officially formed in December of 1969 and is what we would consider today to be the IRA. During this time, violence was rampant and resulted in many civilian deaths, mostly caused by the PIRA. Leading up to the Birmingham pub bombings, both the PIRA and the British ramped up their violence, with British paratroopers even firing into a crowd of Irishmen on Bloody Sunday in January of 1972. Britain wrestled heavily with its tactics, not wanting to undermine its liberal legislation. After a long, bloody, and intense history of conflict between the Irish and the British, the context for the Troubles makes a little more sense. Now we can get back to the bombings. It was on the evening of November 21st, 1974. Prior to the explosions, the Mulberry Bush Pub and the tavern in the town were operating as they had on any other day. Known for being gathering places for teenagers and families, it was otherwise a normal night. At the same time, the Birmingham Post and Mail received a call from a man who spoke the message.
There is a bomb planted in the rotunda, and there is a bomb in New Street at the tax office. This is a double X.
The phrase, "This is double X," was a known code word used by the PIRA to indicate a serious threat. At 8:17 p.m., the first bomb went off in the Mulberry Bush Pub, with the second in the tavern in the town minutes later. 220 people were injured in the worst terrorist atrocity on English soil at the time. Following the bombings, there was a wave of anti-Irish sentiment among the British people, which involved demands for the hanging of convicted terrorists and for a new police campaign against the PIRA. It even included some violent attacks on Irish people. The PIRA continued its bloodthirsty attacks throughout the end of the year, carrying out assassinations and bombings every few days. The British and Irish sentiments and responses to these attacks are informed by their immense history of cultural, religious, and political turmoil, which would not be soon forgotten.
Aside from the rapid British public response to the bombings, the British government was equally quick to respond with reactionary legislation. The House of Commons drafted a new bill in one night, which then passed on to the House of Lords the next day. It came into effect on November 29th, 8 days after the bombings.
The result of their work was the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 1974. The most important parts of this act are the sections on deportation and detainment. The gist of the act is that emergency powers were given to the Secretary of State to deport those suspected of being a part of or aiding in the operations of a proscribed organization, PIRA being the prime target. It also gave British constables the power to detain those they suspect of being associated with a proscribed organization for up to 48 hours without a warrant. It isn't too difficult to see the controversy in this act, as it restricts the civil liberties granted to British citizens.
The legislation itself seems to convey the emotional attitude of the British public at the time. It comes off as very frantic and reactive, which is exactly how the British people and Parliament responded. It also seems to me that this was an additional victory for the PIRA. The goal of insurgents is to undermine the authority of the government, and a panicky response restricting citizens' civil liberties certainly doesn't give the appearance of a government in control.
Organizations within the British and international communities didn't think so either. The NCCL, or the British National Council for Civil Liberties, is an advocacy group that fights for British citizens' civil liberties. What a surprise there.
The NCCL was very vocal in its response to this act. Catherine Scorer wrote a case for repeal for the NCCL that was published in the International Journal of Politics in 1980. One of her main objections was that it revoked the liberal safeguard of due process. This effect would be especially important 11 years later. Oh, this is just water.
The Birmingham Six were the 6 people accused of causing the Birmingham pub bombings. They were convicted in 1975 under immense pressure on the police to find and arrest the perpetrators. The prosecution's evidence had little credibility, and the circumstances of the confessions were hardly just. The Birmingham Six served a 16-year sentence until their conviction was overturned in 1991. In this aspect, the criticisms by the NCCL were spot on.
Scorer mentions that there was no monthly report to Parliament on the operation of this act, which further undermines the UK's commitment to civil liberty principles. The NCCL also expressed concerns that the act would become the new norm for criminal proceedings and that it would contravene the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically the rights to liberty and security, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and protection against discrimination. The UK officially derogated from its commitments to the convention in 1975.
To derogate in this case is to abstain from an international agreement, such as the European Convention on Human Rights. The UK also broke its obligations in accordance with the ICCPR, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a legally binding international agreement. The agreement didn't go into effect until 1976, 2 years after the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 1974. Even so, the UK signed the agreement in 1968, which makes the act a contradiction to their values about international human rights.
In addition to domestic outcries against the act, Human Rights Watch was also concerned. It commented on the UK's suspicious derogation from the European Convention on Human Rights and was particularly concerned about physical abuse against detainees by British constables.
I'd like to once again remind you that under this act, constables may detain any suspicious person for up to 48 hours without a warrant. This whole situation just screams human rights violations. Let's be serious. When a country officially derogates from its commitment to human rights, what do you think it's gonna do? Pour their detainees a cup of tea and request that they talk through their problems? Warm up to them with a game of cricket? I mean, really, who even knows what they do in this sport? Anyway.
Human Rights Watch also found that police searches ended very destructively under the act. They note that constables were very rarely subject to prosecution for misconduct. Sound familiar?
From 1969 to 1991, police or soldiers have only been prosecuted in 19 cases in which killings took place while they were on duty. Of those, only 3 defendants were found guilty, and only 1 saw time in prison.
Human Rights Watch also indicated an erosion of free speech at the time of the article's publishing in 1991. Even though the UK isn't as committed to free speech as other countries, it's still an important reversal of liberalism.
Before we dive into analyzing the effects of this act, we need to first contextualize how it affected future legislation. The act's name is the Prevention of Terrorism Temporary Provisions Act of 1974. The phrase temporary provisions implies that it would be temporary, and originally it was. It was set to expire 6 months after it came into effect, but was renewed and revised in 1975. The amendments made to the bill made it even more controversial. The first negative change was that the bill would expire after 1 year, but could be renewed for 12 months, an infinite number of times. To make matters worse, another amendment made it illegal to not pass on information to the police regarding terrorist offenses. I don't know if I would call this new act of 1976 an improvement. However, throughout the end of the century, there were changes made to the bill that resulted in significantly improved commitments to civil liberties, although they still resembled the original act. By the dawn of the new millennium, a new act, simply called the Terrorism Act of 2000, was the final act against terrorism directly in response to the conflicts in Northern Ireland. They finally removed the temporary provisions part of the bill. Hey, at least they were honest.
Taking an aggregate view of the British response, does it result in democratic backsliding? First, democratic backsliding is when a state eliminates political institutions sustaining an existing democracy. Definitionally, the UK did see a degree of democratic backsliding as a result of these acts, beginning with the most controversial, the Act of 1974.
The UK systematically revoked civil liberties from its citizens without a doubt.
Derogating from international covenants, extending powers to the police and Secretary of the State, you name it, the UK did see negative long-term effects on certain liberal institutions. Even though the United Kingdom's democratic structure saw certain hardships under these acts, I don't think this case shows the whole picture. Yes, thank you. The United Kingdom has seen positive and significant progress in its commitments to human rights and liberal democracy over the past 30-plus years. One example of this is the adoption of the Human Rights Act of 1998, which domestically incorporated legislation from the European Convention on Human Rights. In addition to that, the Universal Periodic Review saw the UK going in a positive direction on its human rights commitments. Still water.
Beginning in 2006, the United Nations started the UPR, or the Universal Periodic Review, which is a periodic review of the human rights records of UN member states. Since its conception, the United Kingdom has received positive feedback on the implementation of human rights into its political systems. Some examples of these developments are the UK's Hate Crime Action Plan in 2016, taking measures to stop hate crime through reporting and education, and the Modern Slavery Act in 2015, introducing procedures to better track and convict perpetrators, just to name a few. In terms of compliance with the values of liberal democracy and human rights protection, the UK has never been better. But counterterrorism policies are inherently reactionary, making them a slippery slope to backsliding. In many cases, counterinsurgency responses do lead to a significant degree of backsliding through civil rights restrictions, discriminatory policies, expansion of executive and police powers, and many more illiberal practices.
So, did the UK democratically backslide as a result of its counterterrorism measures? From a definitional standpoint, yes, but in a meaningful way, hardly. The negative international and domestic response to the passing of the Prevention of Terrorism Acts was an important step in keeping the government of the UK in check. Atrocities were certainly committed. The Act limits civil liberties more than it protects them, but it is developed in such a way that it is no longer a threat to British liberal democracy. Although the UK's counterterrorism policies have had a rocky evolution, it didn't allow its democracy to decline as a result of militia groups. The solution isn't perfect, but it should be a guide for other countries struggling with protecting human rights and democracy while fighting insurgents.
If you made it this far, thank you for watching the video, and I hope you liked learning a thing or two about the UK's response to the Birmingham pub bombings. A ton of work went into making this video, so please do consider leaving a like and subscribing if you'd like to see more content on the people's history. Have a great day!